Blackhawks fans, welcome to a brand new edition of the Four Feathers podcast. I am on loose, joining you here this evening on a solo mission. Unfortunately, Mr. Marchese's a little bit under the weather, and we had to talk some Blackhawks hockey on the eve of the NHL trade deadline on this Thursday. So I am here doing some solo duty. So if you're joining in, if you're just tuning in just now, jump in the comment section, talk along with me throughout the course of this show. We got a lot to discuss. So we're going to get into it and talk plenty about the trades that have occurred and talk about some of these past games, the last four now coming out of the Olympic break. And of course, let's not forget, we are also here to talk about some other random things and, of course, ruffle some feathers and hand out some stick taps. My good friend, Mr. Guilty, in the comments. This man loose does not rest. No, I do not, sir. This is just this is my life. We keep going and we keep it moving. But let's get into it. I'm actually excited to talk Blackhawks hockey because I'll tell you what, for anybody that knows, I am GM Ron. I love NHL trade deadline week. It's one of my favorite weeks of the year. And the the NFL kind of hijacked it from me this week. I'm a little upset. And I know that probably confuses a lot of people because I'm a big football fan at heart. Football is a sport I played as an athlete. Obviously, a huge part of the Bears on Tap crew. So I'm not mad in that sense, but it has stolen some of the thunder away from NHL trade deadline for me. And that makes me upset because I love this week. It's one of my favorites of the year. I think the only thing that gets me just as excited is the NFL draft and the NHL draft and then free agency for the NHL when that opens. NFL free agency doesn't do it for me. I think because the whole tampering period thing kind of like there's no excitement to it. You know everything that's happening before the league year opens 3 days in advance typically or a few days in advance. So I digress. I'm off my soapbox. We're going to talk about NHL trades. I know there's a lot going on the Bears side of the world here for Chicago sports fans. I encourage you, if you have not already, Sonny Burma and I were due to go live right before that news broke. And luckily our ADHD kicked in and it took us a couple minutes to get going. And we were able to be some of the first people on any airwaves and any platform talking about the DJ Moore trade. So if you're looking for that, I encourage you to check that episode out. But we're here to start talking some trades. So let's get into it, shall we? The first trade that the Chicago Blackhawks made was none other than the Connor Murphy trade. Connor Murphy sent to the Edmonton Oilers. This trade broke earlier in the week. The Blackhawks retained 50% of Murphy's contract. Really no surprise there. Edmonton's cap situation is an absolute hellhole. In return, the Blackhawks get a 2028 second round pick. And I know everybody's probably wondering, what the fuck do they need a second round pick in 2028 for? Kyle Davidson's already made it abundantly clear that he wants extra picks in future years at this point in the rebuild. And we're going to talk a little bit, I think, more in depth about that later as I hand out some stick taps. But I think it's important to note that there's a good chance that that pick doesn't actually get used. And if it does, maybe it's the second selection the Blackhawks are making in 2028 because they're flipping their own first round pick elsewhere. And I think that's something that's critically important to keep in mind, right? If they are starting to compete, if there's a trade on the table that makes sense for the Blackhawks, and if it requires trading away some of that draft capital, it's okay to have that future draft capital because you can move it. It doesn't mean that he's going to use it. Now, we'll see what the future holds. But I think that's something to keep in mind here with some of these deals. So that was the first trade. And then there was a little bit of silence. And then friendly foe comes back to the Blackhawks. Again, the Edmonton Oilers and the Blackhawks make a second trade. This one breaks on Wednesday night, so March 4th. And that was Jason Dickinson and Colton Dach heading to the Edmonton Oilers. If anybody's familiar with the Stan Bowman regime, there's no man that loves to retread his players after he trades them away or after he's, in this case, left a city and gone elsewhere than Stan Bowman. Colton Dach was one of his draft picks in his last draft of 2021. It was a second-round pick in that draft. And now he's an Edmonton Oiler under Stan Bowman. He's an RFA, probably a guy they can keep for lesser money next year. It kind of fits the Edmonton Oilers window. So I'm not terribly surprised that they wanted Colton Dach in this deal. In return, the Blackhawks receive Andrew Mangiapane, which Mangiapane was a player I liked years ago. I think we're a little past that now, but he's a fascinating player, has $3.6 million this year. He's also under contract for next year. Don't get it twisted. If he doesn't produce, especially with the number of young guys that are going to be integrated into this lineup come next season, there's zero doubt in my mind that they'll happily give him the Andreas Athanasiou treatment. And for anybody that might not recall what that was, he didn't produce and they sent him to the AHL and they said, your cap dollars are helping us no matter where you're playing. But because you're not good enough to play on our NHL roster right now, you're going to go play with the Ice Piggies out in Rockford. And I think that could happen to Mangiapane. But this is also a guy now that he's going to get a look probably for the rest of the season as a part of this roster because the Blackhawks have effectively moved off of probably one more forward than I think they were expecting. We'll see what happens with Ilya Mikheyev. That is still largely up for debate at this point in time, but we will have to keep an eye on that. The first round pick, of course, has a condition. It was well reported this time. There was some good shade thrown. I will give love to where it is due. I know Tony and I had talked before this show leading up in the week, and Mr. Marchese said that his stick tap was probably going to go out to one Pierre LeBrun. So we will get to that a little bit more in detail later. But I'm gonna hold myself accountable to make sure I share that on Tony's behalf. The condition on the first round pick for the Blackhawks, it is a 2027 first. Now, mind you, the Edmonton Oilers did not have their own first round pick in this coming year's draft in 2026. So no surprise there, but it is top 12 protected unless Edmonton trades their 2028 pick. So in the event that the Edmonton Oilers trade their 2028 pick, then no matter what happens with the Edmonton Oilers, even if they finish in the top 12 of the draft lottery, the pick still goes to the Chicago Blackhawks. Ironically, that's exactly what just happened with the San Jose Sharks. They own Edmonton's first round pick for 2026. It had the same stipulation on it. And because now that they traded their 2027 pick to the Blackhawks, that 2026 pick is locked in to be the San Jose Sharks pick. Now, granted, the Oilers are almost a lock to make the playoffs. It would take a catastrophic collapse of the Edmonton Oilers down the stretch here for them to not make the postseason. So no matter what, it was probably going to go to the Sharks, but that was the stipulation. So now the Sharks know for sure they have that pick about a month and a half sooner than they would have otherwise when it comes down to it. And of course, money was retained here, 50% once again for Jason Dickinson. And with taking Mangiapane's money, it allows the Oilers to make that work for them for the rest of the season. Now, withholding money on Dickinson is important to note because let's say the Blackhawks do trade Nick Foligno or trade Ilya Mikheyev. They are out of retention slots. So for those that are not familiar how that works, every team in the NHL can retain on money on up to 3 contracts over the duration of those contracts. Now, obviously, if a contract expires and you no longer owe money on it or holding cap money on it, then that clears up a space, right? We've seen the Blackhawks utilize this over the course of this Kyle Davidson rebuild over the last few years. They did it with Josh Bailey and his buyout. They did it with Seth Jones, which is what one of those slots is currently being used for at this moment. And then now they've done it with Murphy and Dickinson. So they cannot retain any more money if they make any trades this season. So in order to make trades work potentially with cap-strapped teams, if they encounter those like the Edmonton Oilers, they will have to then either take back a bad contract of some kind to offset the money and make it work, or they just won't make those trades. So that's, I think, something to keep in mind here as we approach Friday's deadline of, will they move it? Will they move Mikheyev? Will they move Foligno? I think they might give Mikheyev the Donato treatment, keep him around, and then try to get back to the negotiating table with him this summer before he hits free agency on July 1st. So all things to keep in mind with those trades. And I think overall I like the trades. Don't get me wrong. I think Jason Dickinson and Connor Murphy are great players. I really enjoyed them as Blackhawks, truly. Certainly going to be fans of those players, even when they're not in an Indian head sweater. Colton Dach. I think he's a great example of a player that is still not quite come into his own yet, but the Blackhawks I think like Landon Slaggert maybe a little bit more in that role. We've seen Slaggert play a lot more coming out of the Olympic break, and we've seen Colton Dach get some healthy scratches. And I think on top of that as well, Colton Dach was going to be a restricted free agent. So they're saying, hey, you know what? We're going to move on from Colton because, we have players like him in the system. I think AJ Spelliscy is a similar type player with arguably maybe a little bit more offensive upside than Colton Dach. So they have names, John Mustard is another name to keep in mind that I think could be that type of player. And hell, even Sasha Boisvert, who we've now learned is going to turn pro. And again, we'll get to that a little bit later as well. He says he models his game after Tom Wilson. And I think that's fascinating because he's a boxer and might be this like hardcore gritty center that I don't think the Blackhawks fans more so than the team itself expected him to be when he was drafted with the 18th overall selection in the draft, not this past year, but the year before. So incredible stuff to keep an eye on. Again, I really like those players, and I really want to bring just quickly attention here to what Connor Bedard said about these trades. It is, I think, a good state of mind as a player on this team to be in is where he's at. He mentioned, of course, his friendship with Colton Dach. He mentioned them talking on vacation about bringing the Stanley Cup to wherever Caribbean island they were on. And it does suck because these players have personal relationships, right? Like these guys are all friends. But it's a business, and I think these guys fully understand that. On top of that, you've also got Connor Bedard saying, well, this kind of motivates you as a player. Because now we want this to be the last season where this is happening at the trade deadline, where we're selling guys off for assets. I think that's a phenomenal approach for this young team. If I'm the Chicago Blackhawks, I players and even coaches, if I'm Blashill, if I'm that entire coaching staff, this is the last year in your mind that we're watching guys depart at the trade deadline because we're not in a position to win games. And they're going to be a very young team next year. And we'll talk some more about that too later on. But I think they're going to have the talent, and with growth from guys such as Bedard, such as Nazar, such as, potentially a couple of these guys that are going to turn pro in the forms of Frondell and Kanserov. Who's to say they can't mess around and make the playoffs, right? Who's to say that they're going to be in a position where Kyle Davidson feels like he needs to trade an expiring Teuvo Teravainen? I don't think they're going to be in that place. I think they're going to be in a position where Kyle Davidson says, hey, if anything, maybe we soft add a guy just to bring some experience down the stretch here and let these guys play meaningful hockey in the months of February, March, and April, because that's just as good for development as, these guys playing with freedom and with, without a microscope on them. So I like where Connor Bedard's head is after this deadline, because they're going to miss these guys, right? You create personal relationships with your teammates. Anybody that's ever played a sport can agree to that sentiment. But it's a note to these players of, hey, we can't let this continue to happen. We need to be better. We need to continue to get better as players. And if we do, then the rebuild's ahead of schedule and things are looking good and everybody's happy. And I think Chicago Blackhawks fans are happy too, because then they're winning more hockey games. And, there's been a lot of chatter, I think, especially on social media apps. I think even just in people's inner circles. I know I've seen some of it as well. But people just kind of being sick of this team losing and they're sick of draft picks and they want to see a team compete. It's starting to happen. You're going to start to see a largely Kyle Davidson created team on the ice as soon as the next 2 weeks, when Lardis inevitably gets called up because he's on a tear right now in Rockford, and Boisvert joins this team when he turns pro, after BU's season is over, because they've not had a good season and I doubt they're going to go far in their conference tournament. and probably Anton Frondell, depending on what Djurgårdens does in their first round of the playoffs. It's a best of 3, and they're currently in the 9 seed, so that means they would have to go on the road. Chances are they could lose, and he's here sooner than people anticipate. So I think now is really the time where, okay, Kyle Davidson, these are your guys. These are no longer veterans that are just holding spots for these young prospects that you drafted. This is a young team comprised of guys that either you signed or you drafted or you gave extensions to, like in the case of Alex Vlasic, because he was technically a Stan Bowman draft pick, even though Davidson was in the organization when they selected him. Now it's starting to get kind of close to the put your money where your mouth is and start to see real progress, not just 10 to 15 points better in the standings and still be in a position to have the top overall pick. Now things need to start to progress, I think, going forward for the Blackhawks. Because I'll tell you what, their last 4 games, they did not progress. And so let's just kind of talk through those briefly. I mean, really the only good game that came out of this was that game in Utah. Fortunately for me, it was the game I got to catch the most of coming out of this break, having to readjust my schedule to get used to Blackhawks hockey being back on after the Olympics. And Arvid Soderblom, first career shutout, 2 goals from Teuvo Teravainen, Nick Foligno scoring his 250th career goal, and then a really nice just effort goal by Landon Slaggert. And a great effort play by Landon Slaggert to help set up Nick Foligno for his 250th goal. What a game. I think what was also encouraging about that game, both Levchinov and Alex Vlasic looked phenomenal. And that is incredibly encouraging because not so much Vlasic. I think people know what Vlasic can be. But now that Murphy's gone, now that, Dickinson's gone, he's got a lot more responsibility on his plate now as the longest tenured Blackhawk, which feels ridiculous to say. That was an important game, I think, for Alex Vlasic as a young player in this league. And again, everybody wants to see growth out of Levchinov, so encouraging stuff there. But the Colorado game, yes, they pissed away a 1-0 lead. Colorado scored 3 of their goals in 20 minutes and 8 seconds of actual game time right before the end of the second period, and of course the 2 in the third to ultimately take the game 3-1. But a sick Bedard goal in that game. Encouraging signs nonetheless. Kind of how the Nashville game felt too. Bedard scored, Bertuzzi scored. Bedard's been racking up points. He had 2 more assists against Winnipeg. He looks healthy, right? I think that's really one of the few things I cared about this team coming out of the Olympic break. Does Connor Bedard look healthy and look like his normal self? He does. But pissing away in the third period with 3 goals for Nashville sucks. And then doing the same against Winnipeg, a 2-1 lead late. They tie it late, they being Winnipeg, and then Winnipeg wins it in overtime. All things that suck to see. And this team needs to learn how to finish these games. And I think that's a big storyline in that locker room for the rest of the season is, hey, if we have a lead, no matter who the opponent is, we need to shut it down. And there was a fascinating stat. I forget who it was from. It might have been from Scott Powers. That this team, when they score 3 or more goals, is 9-1 or something like that this season. But when they score 2 or less, and I think maybe it's over the last 25 games, but when they score less than 2, they're like 4-10-1. They got to start putting pucks in the back of the net. And Connor Bedard being healthy is going to help with that. But you need to start seeing it from some other guys. I think that's why Nick Lardis coming up at some point here is going to be important. I think Oliver Moore returning to center now that Dickinson's gone is important. I don't think he plays as well on the wing. And some guys are like that. I feel the same way about Moore that I do about Connor Bedard. Brian Green, right? Had a really nice goal as well against Winnipeg. These guys are going to have to start to step up here if this team's going to win some games down the stretch. And I know they're probably silver lining wins at this point in the season, but again, they are just as important for development as, your skills camps and things like that for these guys when they work in the off season. If you're winning hockey games and you're applying these practice habits to game time, that's going to help your development when it's all said and done for this young team. So again, just we're at the point in the season, especially with the trade deadline right now, where these last 4 games largely sucked outside of the Utah game. There's some good games coming up that the Hawks should win. one being against Vancouver this coming Friday at the United Center. And I say this coming Friday, tomorrow when I'm recording this. It'll be something to keep an eye on, and hopefully they can put up about 4 or 5 goals on a pretty bad Vancouver team who is expected to sell Connor Garland. They've listened on Brock Besser. I mean, that's probably a team in the off season that you might see torn down to the studs a little bit outside of maybe 1 or 2 names. Obviously, Quinn Hughes is already gone. I think that list is just going to continue to get bigger for the Chicago Blackhawks, for the Vancouver Canucks, pardon me, when it's all said and done. And they continue to rip it down, in position to get the first overall pick and possibly land a Gavin McKenna or an Ivan Stornberg or Ivar Stenberg, all going to be important for a bad team like the Canucks, who probably will be bad for a while, which there's a little bit of a sicko in me of remembering those rivalries from the 2010s that I'm really okay with seeing them suck for a while. And I might relish in it a little bit because I don't like the Canucks, and I never have, and I never will. Don't like Vancouver at all. Neither here nor there. Let's keep this thing moving. Let's focus on player development, player growth, guys that we're going to see arrive on this team soon, right? We mentioned Nick Lardis. Not going to go too deep into that. We've already gotten a taste of what he is as a player. I'm hoping when he returns, though, and comes back up to this team for the remainder of the season, that he took some of the things he learned in his first stint, applied them in Rockford, and now brings that back more refined than it was before, right? We saw Wyatt Kaiser do that a season ago and really grew as a player, and we've seen how important he's been. It looks like we're going to see him back as well come Friday, which is spectacular. I think Ethan Del Mastro has done a fine job as well. We're going to really see a lot of these young guys and what they can do when it's all said and done. But let's talk about another defenseman, not Ethan Del Mastro, not Artem Levshinov, not even Sam Renzel, but Kevin Korchinski. I am not sure what's going on. It's in my notes here as the curious case of Kevin Korchinski, because when he was called up during the Olympic break, when teams could start practicing again as of whatever the date was, I believe it was February 17th, he and Sam Renzel were both recalled to the team. And it was, okay, we're going to get to see what both of these kids can do for the rest of the season. And then Korchinski really hasn't played. He was a healthy scratch against Nashville because Sam Renzel played and Connor Murphy was still on the team, and so was Grizzlick, and everybody else was largely still the same, right? Levshinov played, of course. Then they played him against Colorado because Sam Renzel's sick. They have no other option, right? Only plays 8 minutes and 28 seconds of ice time. So they essentially play with 5 defensemen in that game. Then the Utah game comes around. Oh, well, you're up 4-0. You're going to give him some ice time, right? Yeah. 10 minutes and 27 seconds of ice time for Kevin Korchinski in that one. And then you scratch him again because you recall Ethan Del Mastro ahead of the game in Winnipeg on Tuesday night, and he doesn't even play. Renzel's back, and they played Del Mastro next to him instead of playing Kevin Korchinski. And then on Thursday, today, as I'm recording this, about 7 hours ago at this point, Kevin Korchinski gets sent back to Rockford. I don't know what is happening with Kevin Korchinski, because unlike Sam Renzel, unlike an Ethan Del Mastro, these guys that I think are, feel like they're clearly part of the future, you have to make a pretty significant decision on Kevin Korchinski sooner than later. And I'm not saying you have to move on from the kid, but starting next season, he has no more options to go back to Rockford. He has to clear waivers. And there is not a chance in hell that a 22-year-old defenseman with the upside that Korchinski has as a former 7th overall draft pick is going to make it through waivers and stay in your organization. I would hope you play him 15, 16, 17, hell, give him 18 minutes a night and just see what the hell he can do. Because guess what? If he shows some flash, but you don't think he fits the future direction of how you're building this hockey team, then Kyle Davidson, I'm sorry to say it, buddy, but you might have to trade him. and recoup. I think you're going to recoup a fair amount of value for Korchinski. I think you could get a really nice young player from another team, especially if it's a team that really likes what Kevin Korchinski brings to the table. But you're not going to be able to sneak him through waivers. What is he going to be, your seventh defenseman next year? Your former first overall pick, your first pick as GM of this team is going to be a seventh defenseman that's a healthy scratch? No, of course not. And don't get me wrong. It's okay if guys don't work out. And the reason I say this is because I know most Hawks fans probably don't remember this because you're blinded by the cup years, and that's totally okay. But Cam Barker was supposed to be the next best thing since sliced bread when he was taken third overall in the draft. He was the next great offensive defenseman. He made James Wisniewski feel obsolete, which we saw Wiz go on and have a great career as an offensive defenseman in the NHL. We thought he was a part of the rebuild fully, and he wasn't then because Cam Barker was there. Cam Barker had a 40-point season at a really young age. And then Cam Barker completely flared out and became nothing. Right? It was just Duncan Keith and Brent Seabrook and a fourth-round pick named Nicholas Hjalmarsson that became your core defenseman, supported by names like Brent Sopel and Johnny Oduya and Brian Campbell and Jordan Hendry and Nick Leddy and Kim Janssen and Michael Roosevelt, and you get it. There's a chance that Korchinski's maybe not a part of this core. Maybe your core is Vlasic and Renzel and Levshinov and Kaiser, with Crevier as a really nice surprise, or maybe Crevier is a part of that core. I don't know. None of us know, right? It's a baseball movie, but like in Moneyball. You don't know. None of us know. None of us know shit. These are all calculated risks. And if it's not working here, if you're not going to give him the opportunity to play, then maybe give the kid a change of scenery. Because if he's going to go to Rockford and waste away there for another year because you can't pass him through waivers, that's a waste. Somebody else will happily take a stab at fixing whatever is not right in his game. There's clearly something they don't like in his game, considering the fact that he played a combined 19 minutes of ice time in 2 games and then was a healthy scratch the other 2. I don't know what's going on with the whole Kevin Korchinski thing, man. And, it's funny because everybody's like, well, he's Kyle Davidson's first draft pick and he's not going to trade him. And maybe he will. Maybe we look back at that 2022 draft and say, wow, isn't it crazy that they ended up dealing Korchinski, who was the 7th overall pick, but Nazar and Sam Renzel became pieces of this future as the other 2 first-round picks in that draft? That's totally possible. That happens all the time. I know people are like, well, a 7th overall pick should be a slam dunk. It should be, but even then, they're not always slam dunks. Remember Niall Yakupov? Right? Cam Barker's a great example. He was a 3rd overall pick. And some guys come on later, right? I mean, look at Dylan Strome, a former Blackhawk. He was a 3rd overall pick. Everybody started calling him a bust. And then he broke out just later in his career. And it kind of started in his time in Chicago. He really started to kind of catch his bearings, and then Stan Bowman fumbled that one, and then he left, and now he's been great. He's been a huge piece of the Washington Capitals, and kind of part of their resurrection as a new looking franchise after departures of household names like TJ Oshie and Nicholas Backstrom. So it'll be fascinating to see what happens with Kevin Korchinski, but that I think is something I am microscoped on for the rest of the season, because if you're not going to give him an opportunity, give him an opportunity somewhere else and do right by the kid. If you don't think it works here, that's okay. And we'll talk about that doing right piece later, because Kyle Davidson addressed it in his interview with the Stretch presented by Barstool. The Barstool Chicago guys, Chief, Eddie and Dave were on this episode, and they asked him kind of about what happens when you trade guys and they move on. And I think Kyle Davidson's answer was great. He said, you root for these guys. You still want them to do well elsewhere because you get to know them as people. And that's why, like, when teams deal guys in good faith and people get upset, I think that's incredibly stupid. Like, if you were running a team and you became super close to somebody and you had to fire him, wouldn't you feel bad? Of course you would. So why are we taking away the human element of sports, right? He wants these guys to do good. And sometimes seeing these guys do good means they have to go somewhere else and get a change of scenery, and that's okay. But if that's the case with Kevin Korchinski, they got to figure something out, because he's either got to be in the NHL next year all the time, or you're going to lose him on waivers for nothing. So there needs to be a decision made on Kevin Korchinski's future. But he's back down to Rockford, so we'll see what happens over the course of the rest of the season, and if he shows anywhere. Because as of right now, it's Ethan Del Mastro's taking his spot on the roster, and they like what Del Mastro brings, and it's going to be a really young group the rest of the way. It's Grzelcyk, it's Rinzel, it's Kaiser, it's Levshinov, it's Crevier, and it's Vlasic, and it's, again, Del Mastro looks like your seventh guy. And maybe they're saying, hey, we're not just going to keep Korchinski up as a seventh guy and not have him play. We'd rather him go down to Rockford and play 20-something minutes a night. Fair, fine, but still, is he going to get a fair shake in the NHL this season? So I digress. Let's talk a little bit more about Sasha Boisvert turning pro, because I think this is a fascinating thing that has popped up on the radar of Blackhawks fans, because it wasn't certain. There were rumblings. I don't know if people recall, but there were rumblings of he was pretty set on, I'm turning pro after my second year of college. And people were assuming that would be a second year of college where he improved and his stats were far better than they were in his freshman year of college at the University of North Dakota, where he was very respectable, 32 points, 38 games. This year, I think he's only suited up for 21 games. I think he's got about 14 points in 21 games. Now, there's kind of a stench at BU in general this year. I don't know what the hell happened to Boston University, but it has not gone well for Boisvert or anybody else on that team this year. And I've seen some jokes about, Tony himself joked and said, get him away just from BU at this point. And then there's a lot of people, a good friend of ours, the prospect Don, Blackhawks Cowboy, who's a part of our network here at OnTap Sportsnet. A few of these guys have said, I think Boisvert's game translates better to the pro game than it does the college game. And I can see that, right? He's a big center. He uses his body. Dare I say, he almost gives me Artem Anisimov vibes in the sense of like how he's built. And, I think he's got a little bit better wheels than Anisimov did, and maybe a little bit more of a scoring touch potentially than Anisimov. But I think if Boisvert comes up and is kind of a tough, rugged forward, which, let's be honest, that's something the Blackhawks really don't have a lot of on the current roster, not named pretty much Ryan Donato or Tyler Bertuzzi, I think that's a welcome thing to add to this roster, right? I think AJ Spellacy is going to be that type of player as well. You need that grit. We've seen it time and time again. The best playoff teams have guys that can get in your face, and yeah, they're scorers, but they're gritty and they can hit and they can kill penalties and win faceoffs. And maybe Boisvert becomes that guy. Maybe Boisvert can become a really good third center. And maybe Oliver Moore becomes a better second center than Nazar. Nazar becomes a winger. You never know. Never know how this shit shakes out. But I'm really, really excited to see him, because, again, I don't think BU is going to go far in their conference tournament, which I believe starts next week. I think they have one last game this coming weekend, and then they start the conference tournament. So, I mean, we could see him as soon as the middle of March, which I think will be fantastic. It just remains to be seen in terms of, again, where the Blackhawks get him in terms of the rest of the season. But I think he's going to get a lot of games, and it's going to be fun to see what Sasha Boisvert brings to the table. Before we get to our next point, a question here from Lebowski. Where is the other dude? Where is Tony Marchese? Tony Marchese is under the weather. For those that are joining us late, he, as of about 4 or 5 hours ago, reached out to me. It was like, hey, man, I feel terrible. Chances are not going to be able to make the show tonight, but I'm going to try my best. And he said he was going to take a nap, and he took a nap, and I called him and he didn't answer. So I think he's in slumberland because he just didn't feel good. So Hoping Mr. Marchese feels better. But we're here to hold it down. We're here to continue to talk about things. And in fact, we're actually kind of starting to wind this thing down here a little bit. We don't have much else to talk about besides our habitual segments and kind of what's on tap next. But of course, the standings update quickly for everybody. The Hawks are 11 points out of a playoff spot and 13 points out of the basement. So again, they kind of hover still in that same territory that they've been for a while. In addition, worth noting, 2 games from those last 4 that we discussed a little bit earlier have been added to the games they'll want back tracker. We're now up to 11 on the season. It was that Nashville game, those 3 third period goals that ultimately led to the loss. And then, of course, the 2-1 lead late against Winnipeg on Tuesday, only to lose 3-2 in overtime. After the game tying goal came with just 42 seconds left in the game. So just a thing to keep in mind there. But without further ado, if I haven't already, I'm going to try to ruffle your feathers.
It's time to ruffle some feathers.
All right, let's ruffle some feathers, shall we? There was a very infamous, I'll call it, graphic that was shared on CHSN on Sunday. This was during the Utah Blackhawks broadcast on CHSN. Pat Boyle was joined by Frank Saravalli in studio as a guest co-host. I think a lot of just the habitual studio hosts have been kind of getting their way back. We've heard Tony Granato on television with Rick Ball right now. I think Panger's still getting back from being over, being just doing, national coverage and things like that. And so he was projecting the team and what it will look like next season. And the first line was still the same: Andre Burakovsky, Ryan Green, Connor Bedard. The second line was Frank Nazar, Anton Frondel, and Roman Kantsarov. Third line was Oliver Moore, Nick Lardis, and I believe it was Tyler Bertuzzi or Teuvo Teravainen. And then your fourth line was Bertuzzi, Donato, and question mark at center, because they really don't know who their fourth line center is going to be. Maybe it's Sasha Boisvert, right? A name we've already talked about here a little bit. And it kind of pissed off a lot of fans, because everybody's like, well, why aren't they trading, for people, or why aren't they signing free agents? Well, first off, the free agency class is not great this year. You're not going to find a lot of talent that's worth the price tag that they're going to try to command. And there's a lot of guys that don't fit the Blackhawks timeline. It's a very old free agency class. A lot of guys in their 30s, probably signing 1 or 2 year deals. Maybe you get a couple guys that'll sign a 3 or a 4 year deal because they're in their early 30s, but it's not a young free agency class in terms of unrestricted guys. There's some fascinating restricted free agent names, and it would be cool to see the Blackhawks kicking tires on some of those names. I know Jason Robertson's the most notable and the one that is probably the most spoken about. But I hate to say it, Frank is not wrong here at all about his predictions, because at some point, these young guys that you invested a ton of capital in, right? Kantsarov was a second-round pick. Frondel is your first-round pick from a year ago. Now, other players that are on the roster, Bedard and Nazar, who aren't going to get a full 82 this year because of their respective injuries, you got to see what they can do. And you got to give spots to them in order to see what they can do and start to shuffle through and figure out what's next. Donato's the only guy of those veterans that's here for a prolonged period of time, because this is the first year of his 4-year deal. Bertuzzi's got 2 years left after this one. Teuvo's entering his last year of his deal after this one. So there's a lot of things to be seen in terms of these young guys. They're going to have to play. Now, granted, if these young guys are as good as the Blackhawks hope they are, they should be a better hockey team next year. If Anton Frondel's as good as we think he is, he should be a good player. Same thing with Roman Kantsarov. Same thing with Connor Bedard and Frank Nazar, right? These guys should all take another step in their at least in Bedard and Nazar's case, in their next seasons. I think we're gonna see a lot of that, and the blue line's gonna be the same way, right? It's a young blue line. Spencer Knight's a young goalie. It's gonna be a young team, but I think that young team is gonna they're gonna be fun. And again, you got to give them the opportunity. Now, granted, if they exceed your expectations and some guys really take that step forward, then maybe Kyle Davidson feels comfortable moving a future first-round pick and a guy or two that he doesn't think are going to work out in their organization or that he feels okay parting with to go get that notable asset to bring in. But it's probably going to have to come through trade because with the cap rising the way it has, free agency is kind of dying. And it kind of sucks. I miss it. I miss when free agency was just an absolute shit show. Now it's kind of, oh, okay, that's a nice little signing. That's an okay little signing. And that's about it. It's kind of underwhelming now, which is boring because stars aren't hitting the market. Their teams can re-sign them. Now, again, water's going to eventually find its level at some point in the future of this CBA. And eventually teams will not be willing to spend all the way to the cap because that cap is probably going to exceed what those teams can actually spend in terms of physical dollars. And when that time comes, we've already heard from Danny Wirtz saying, yeah, we fully plan on being a team that spends all the way to the cap because we can, which is encouraging. And I think that's when you'll see the Blackhawks really be able to do that kind of stuff. But right now it's kind of hard and you need to be able to establish the base. So again, I know how Lebowski feels here. You know, Saravelli sucks. He should not be on television. I agree. I think he's an okay insider, but he should not be on TV. And he says he was wrong on Sam Rizzo. He said Rinzel would not see a minute in the AHL. Yeah, and I mean, Sam Rinzel's developed and become a really fascinating hockey player and a really fun hockey player to watch at that. But I think in terms of what this team looks like next year, he's not wrong. And I know that's what a lot of people don't want to hear. But they're going to be young. They're not going to be adding any sexy names from outside the organization. If they're adding sexy names, it's guys that are already in the organization. These prospects that need to get an opportunity and a look. Don't forget, Roman Cancero is having one of like the greatest KHL seasons for a player under the age of 21 ever in the league. And that's a good league. That's probably not even probably. That is the second best league in the world behind the NHL. He's putting up points that rival Ilya Kovalchuk and Kirill Kaprizov and some of those guys. If that's the case, it's hard not to get excited. I know he's small, but he's a scorer, man, and that's what he knows how to do best. And it'll be really fun to see some of those young guys next year. But probably not going to see a lot of sexy names, and I know that upsets a lot of people, unfortunately. Let's try to turn this around a little bit. Let's be a little more positive here.
Time to give out some stick taps.
Stick taps from me are going to go to Kyle Davidson. Now, I'm going to bookmark a little bit of this because I know Tony wanted to play devil's advocate here, and this was going to be a real good back and forth debate. And unfortunately, him being under the weather has now prevented that, at least on this episode. But I'm sure we're gonna return to it next show. So I'm going to encourage everybody to keep that in mind. But I'm going to give out a stick tap to Kyle Davidson, and it's for his interview. And it's not so necessarily the context of what he said. I think everything he said makes sense. Like they're rebuilding. You know, you have to figure out who can do what. It's not a magical wand. You're not entirely sure immediately. You know, there's growth that needs to occur, development, and they've invested a lot in the development infrastructure of the Blackhawks, which I think is also critically important to note. But it was fun just seeing him be a normal dude and almost humanizing the position of being a general manager. I think that's what I enjoyed most about his interview and why he's getting a stick tap from me, because he's just like everybody else. He just happens to have an insane job as general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks, which are a team that absolutely needed to be torn down to the studs at the time that it was, because Stan Bowman wrecked the Lamborghini he was handed as GM when he really shouldn't have become the GM, because Dale Talon was doing fine, but got fired because of all the crap that happened with the restricted free agents and the tendering not getting done correctly. I think it was a great interview. And if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend it. I know there's some people out there that are anti-Barstool or whatever, but it's just the Barstool Chicago guys, and it's a really informative interview. I highly recommend everybody listens to it. Again, and I think it just gives good insight. You know, he was a little more honest, I think, than your traditional political answers, which is another reason for some of the stick taps. And it was just, again, it was a really fascinating interview to listen to. So I enjoyed listening to it. I think everybody else will as well. So that's my stick tap, goes to Kyle Davidson. And I think he got great value on the trades. You got a future second out of Connor Murphy. You got a future first out of Jason Dickinson and Colton Dach. and Andrew Mangiapane, who's going to be kind of a fascinating name to watch for the rest of the season and see, A, if he really even gets that much run, and B, if he doesn't, does he get the Andreas Athanasiou treatment because he's got another year in his contract, and that was a cap dump for the Edmonton Oilers. Since he was already sent down to the AHL by them, and they were carrying some of his cap hit already on the books. So it's gonna be it's gonna be interesting to see. But I think Kyle Davidson all around trade deadline. We'll see if he makes any more moves between now and Friday. We'll probably be back with you guys on Sunday. I'm hoping Tony and I can then have that Kyle Davidson debate here a little bit as well. And maybe there's more trades to discuss. We'll have to wait and see. But the deadline comes up tomorrow afternoon. I believe it's 4:00 Eastern, so 3:00 Central Time will be the deadline. Of course, remember, because that's just when you have to be in the queue for the trade calls with the league office. The trades themselves might not get reported until later. Sometimes they trail out about an hour and a half after, depending how much action there is when it's all said and done. So keep that in mind. Just because 3:00 comes and you don't hear anything doesn't mean it's totally done yet. If we get to 5:00 and you don't hear anything, then it's probably done when it comes to the NHL trade deadline. And then again, the Blackhawks are in action tomorrow night against the Vancouver Canucks. It's a 7:30 puck drop at the United Center. It's a good another Friday night hockey matchup. I believe it's the penultimate one of the season. I think the final Friday night hockey that the Blackhawks will have will be when the Avalanche come to town in 2 weeks. And that'll be on Friday night. And that's also the last game against the Avs that they'll wear the black jerseys for this season. So if you want to get out and see that, I highly recommend that you do. What's on tap next? Well, what's on tap next? We already mentioned the Friday's game against the Vancouver Canucks. That's on CHSN at 7:30. Then the Blackhawks go on the road. It's a back-to-back on Sunday and Monday. The first game is in Dallas, Texas against the Stars. That's a 5:00 start Central Time. So a little early evening hockey, which will be kind of fun to see. That's also on CHSN. And then on Monday, they're back at the United Center. They play the Utah Mammoth, who they just saw this past Sunday. That's a 7:30 start at the United Center on CHSN as well. And then they have 2 days off before they're back in Utah. But this time, instead of a 3:00 start on a Sunday, like this past game was against the Mammoth, it'll be an 8:00 start local time. They're an hour behind us in terms of time zones. And again, that is on CHSN. That'll be Thursday, March 12th. And we will certainly be back with you on a show between now and at least the post game of that March 12th game. So we'll have another What's on Tap next with what's to come in the future. To those that listened along with me in this solo episode of mine, I certainly appreciate you. I know it's a little bit late. It's still a work night for everybody, but happy Friday to everybody as you are listening to this, hopefully on your morning commute, if you weren't able to join us live. If you do want to watch these when they go live, head over to the On Tap Sportsnet YouTube channel, hit subscribe, hit that bell button, and you'll know when all of our shows go live. Four Feathers Podcast, Bears on Tap, the Building the Board show was live tonight talking about receivers. That was a great episode, and encourage everybody to go check that one out as well. As I mentioned, Bears on Tap was also live earlier today discussing the DJ Moore trade. And again, baseball is right around the corner as well. Here is the World Baseball Classic, and the season are on the horizon. Be sure to check out Cubs and Sox on Tap as well. And of course, our guys over at Bulls on Tap. It's a new looking show, but they're doing a phenomenal job. Be sure to check out those guys over there as well. Sal and Justin are absolutely crushing it as the voices of Bulls on Tap. And of course, encourage everybody to head over to ontapsportsnet.com and follow at ontapsportsnet on the socials. Follow us at Four Feathers Pod. And if you're listening to us on podcast, we'd appreciate if you left a 5-star rating. And if you don't think we're worth 5 stars, tell us what we're doing wrong. And we'll certainly aim to improve. Again, I appreciate everybody joining me here on the eve of the NHL trade deadline. This one was titled Trades, Trends, and Tragic Endings. Some brutal losses along the way are some of those tragic endings. The trends of how this team is building and some of those trades that have happened. Of course, the trades themselves are the highlights of our show here tonight. We look forward to seeing you soon. From myself, GN Ron, and everybody at Four Feathers Podcast, we wish you a great weekend. And as always, let's go Hawks.